Hello, good day everyone. I am Erica Jane Piasayo. I, together with Ms. Eva Andales, will going to report the learners from Indigenous Group. People or most of us made an unfounded assumption about how a person will behave or how an indigenous person will behave or act in a certain environment. Makaingon tanong ha, kanang kaya ba ka niya nga naa siya sa kauban nato like uh, appropriate ba ka na iyang i-act no or sakto ba ka ha kanang makasurvive ba ka siya arhino nga kauban nato wala siya sa iyang kanang iha nga place o kana or tribe. Realizing that our preconceived ideas were not completely accurate. Yes, because dili tanan nga atong mga assumptions, ang atong mga judgments are accurate. No, mostly magani maliit ta. Because kanang judge lang ta na judge without a concrete basis. Kay without knowing the ay ang kana atong gi-judge or ang atong gisulti sa iya halahi ra day kung unsa siya, di ba? So no matter what we are dealing with, sometimes our expectations about people, about indigenous people are burned out, and other times we are surprised to find out how different an individual is from the stereotype we based our expectations on. Mostly magud kita no kay murag nalumos na ta sa mga stereotypes, sa mga judgment. Mauna nga kanang kung unsa ang atong mabatian sa ilaha, kung unsa ang stereotype about nga certain races, mo na gyud na atong murag matuhan mo na nga sometimes mo na nga we were surprised if naay kanang tao nga kanang naay tao nga kanang maka makapakita sa ato nga lahi da ay ang atong expectations sa ilaha. Just like Norman King, 'di ba kung moingon tang indigenous people when it comes to education ha kanang sorry to mention it but kanang murag bulok kina bitaw mga hinay, dili ka tiwas og eskwela kay lagi pobre ilang family, dili ka support ilang family sa ilaha. But if you know Norman King, he was the first ATA who graduate in UP. 'Di ba? Without knowing di ay nga kanang mao na ang atong gituuhan about sa ilaha but naay mga tao, naay mga indigenous person nga makapasurprise sa ato nga mali da ay ang atong pagtuo sa ilaha no. Kay they are still human, they have still their own talent nga kanang makapa-change kung unsa ang atong pagtuo sa ilaha. Actually daghan na ang mga indigenous persons nga nakagraduate sa kanang college. If makita mo at bawal judgmental nga ang ilang mga visitors is mga indigenous people na nag-graduate sa different schools no, but mostly lang sa ilang kanang ilang gipili ang nga mo trabaho sa ilang place, wala sila diri sa kanang lungsod. Learners from indigenous groups. This topic will enable us to show comprehensive skills in delivering culturally appropriate teaching strategies to address effectively the needs of learners from indigenous groups. So this topic will help us have a knowledge of what are the appropriate skills and appropriate teaching strategies to be able to be effective teacher towards indigenous learners so that they will gain the appropriate knowledge that they need. So that is why, according to DepEd, there is a need for teachers serving in indigenous communities to be adequately oriented and trained because there are many aspects that need to consider in teaching indigenous communities. For example, is their culture. An indigenous teacher should be sensitive in order for the indigenous learners to be felt cared, belong, accepted, and, and so that they will not ashamed of who they are and what they are. Also, their language. Kailain man sad og atong i-force sila nga mo istorya og Tagalog or English, di ba? Kay babi ata nga indigenous people, they have their own language. And mostly sa ila dili kay baw mo Tagalog, especially English. So in order to share, in order to teach effectively, a teacher also need to be flexible and use their own language so that a teacher maka-share effectively ug masabtan effectively sa mga students ang lessons nga i-tackle. Teaching in indigenous communities, indigenous culture should be appreciated, and indigenous cultural practices and values are not discriminated as backward, inferior, invalid, or primitive. So that a teacher that will teach in indigenous communities will be adequately oriented, since a teacher will help the indigenous learners to appreciate their culture, so that they will proud of who they are and what they are. Dili sila and they will preserve their practices and values, and they will not see their culture or their tribe as an inferior or primitive and backward. So at the end of this topic, we will be able to know the indigenous people and their education, know the challenges faced by the indigenous people in the educational context, identify solutions to mitigate marginalization among indigenous people, and also relate to their situation and develop a moral support towards indigenous people. So for me, as a pre-service teacher and a citizen, the most important part that a person should learn in this topic is to develop a moral support towards indigenous people, so that uh, they will get the appropriate rights, and so that they will recognized by all people. So what are indigenous people? They are described as any group of people native to a specific region. In other words, people who lived in a place before colonists or settlers arrived, defined new borders, and began to occupy the land. So here's some pictures of our indigenous brothers and sisters from different regions. We have the Igorot from Cordillera, the Aita from Luzon, the Mangyan from Occidental and Oriental Mindoro, Moro from Mindanao, Tomanok from Panay Island, and Lumad from Mindanao. They are our indigenous brothers and sisters who always sought recognition of their identities, way of life, and their rights to traditional lands, territories, and, and national resources for years. But unfortunately, no, throughout history, their rights have always been violated. That is why they really deserve an inclusive education where they have the opportunity to learn and educate with a proper system and proper way of teaching, so that they would be knowledgeable, have the confidence, and have and gain braveness to fight for their rights. Our country is a culturally diverse country with an estimated 14 to 17 million indigenous peoples or IPs belonging to 110 ethno-linguistic groups. They are mainly concentrated in northern Luzon, which had 30%, and in Visayas, less than 10%, and in Mindanao, more than 60%. Indigenous learners in the context of education. The Philippine historical accounts show that IPs in the Philippines have long been suffering from discrimination and lack of access to education. That is why there are many laws recognizes the rights of indigenous people, as well as law that protect them. We have the Philippine Constitution, which mandated the state recognition, protection, promotion, and fulfillment of the rights of indigenous people. We also have here the Republic Act 8371, or known as the Indigenous People Act, which recognized the right of IPs or indigenous people to manage their ancestral domains. It has become the cornerstone of current national policy on IPs. And over last 20 years, the rights of indigenous people have been recognized. We have the 23 ratification of the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention from 1991, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or UNDRIP in 2007, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2016, the establishment of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people. Also, the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous people. It is great knowing that there are lots of laws protecting them no, and recognizing them. But the question is, despite all these laws and public recognition towards indigenous people, have we educate the rest of the world to recognize, respect, and promote our IP brothers and sisters? Yes, na ay mga laws issued, but unsaon man natong papel nga nakasuwat nga i-protect or respect sila, dili i-discriminate and etc. But we ourselves or the citizens never recognized and promote them. As well as wala kay bawaan nga mga laws. It's somewhat useless. That is why we need to ensure that our educational practices, languages, environmental conservation, laws, and management is acknowledged and respected globally, not only by governments but by all people. Mao lagi na ilang giingon unsaon man ang balaod sa gobyerno if naasad lain balaod ang mga tao, di ba? Or wala kay baw ang mga tao. Unsaon nga natong ingon nga anti-discrimination kung ang mga tao dili mo recognized and mosunod ana. That is why until now, our IPs are still seeking for justice and for their rights because dili completely na-recognize and promote sila. Kaya kung na-promote and recognize pa lang no, wala na mo exploit sa ilang mga ancestral domains and even their rights as a person. Wala na say mag-rally-rally nga mulaban, mga rally nga mulaban para sa ilang mga rights. And that as a pre-service teacher who are given the opportunity, knowing this, let us give a single time to promote them, no? Ilabi na karon nga one click lang sa atong phones, pwede na maka-reach of thousands or millions of people around the world. Let us also make use those advanced tools to promote awareness about indigenous people. Kay sila biya dili ingon ka-advance ato Their life centered only to their simple living, nga magtanom or unsa man aron mabuhi. So much for that. Murag taas-taas na kong gitabi. So, I will proceed na. So, our indigenous people are the most vulnerable sectors of our society, suffering from abject poverty, malnutrition, exploitation, conflict, and violence, discrimination, alienation of their natural resources, and human rights violation. Maybe we can ask ngano kano. So here are the reasons as well as the challenges faced by the indigenous people. They have the less access to education, poor quality of education, lack of equal access to basic services. Uneducated parents continue to face inclusion and marginalization. Because education is an integral part of one's life which is included na sa atong basic needs as a person or human being, and education is a way to defeat poverty. So because they have the less access to education, they have the poor quality of education, so na-adjoy ako nga tendency nga kanang mostly jud sa ilaha mga pobre. And then i-discriminate, and then ilang parents walay ka ng enough financial support since they also are non-educated. So also to diminish marginalization of indigenous people in the context of education. So how to diminish those challenges now they faced? So we have to build public awareness, build a harmonious relationship with the indigenous people, encourage the state to fulfill wider rights and to recognize the rights to education. So what I have said earlier, let us promote and build awareness towards people nga ato ipahibaw sa uban na unsa ang status sa indigenous peoples in a community and in an educational context, so that kanang so that people will have the guts, or so that people recognize them and dili na sila i-discriminate, and also the state to fulfill wider rights and to recognize their education. Maka-provide na sila enough resources